My name's Annabelle and today I'll be teaching you how to tell the time. Time is a very, very important skill that we use in our everyday lives, from knowing when lunch will be ready to figuring out when your favourite TV programme will be back on. We think and use time all the time. So, as telling the time is a lifelong skill, it's very, very important that we know how to tell the time and we know how to do it correctly, as this is the concept that we'll be using for the rest of our lives. So here is the learning objectives and targets page that will have every lesson, which are sort of guidelines to help us know what we need to understand and learn by the end of the lesson. So for example, in this lesson, we must learn and understand the difference between an analog clock and a digital clock, which are quite different, and also how to calculate the hours and minutes that are on a clock, specifically an analog clock, which I've put at the bottom of the page for you here. This blue one. As you can see, it's circular and it's got a set of hands, and we will talk about this further in the next slide. So this slide is about the difference between an analog clock, which you'd usually find on a wall in class or maybe at home, and a digital clock, which you'd maybe find on a bedside table or a desk. So I'd like you to have a little think about it for about 1 minute, and then we're going to confer together about our ideas. So as you can probably tell, the biggest difference is how these clocks tell the time. So as you can see, with the digital clock, we've got a number before these two dots here and a number after these two dots. So these two dots are what we refer to as colons, and this is how you spell colons. Let me just write it for you. So these two dots are called colons, okay? There we go. So these two dots here are called colons. All right, so the number before the colon represents the hour, which I've represented by the letter H, and the numbers after the colons, which are typically two numbers, represent the minutes. Okay, so if the time was 9 o'clock, it would look something like this on the digital clock. However, this is very, very different to the analog clock, because with the analog clock, as you can see, there are two lines which we refer to as hands. So I'm just going to type that on the side. The two lines on an analog clock are called hands, okay? And this is how we are enabled to tell the time on an analog clock. So the shorthand represents the hours, so it's 4 hours, so it's 4, and then the longhand represents the minutes, okay? So when it points to the 12, that represents that it's 4 o'clock. Anytime the longhand is on the 12, it means it's that number of the shorthand o'clock. So for example, if let's say the time was, let's say, maybe 3 o'clock, okay, this is what it would look like. So we would erase this, and the shorthand would be on the 3, and the longhand would be on the 12, okay? Because 12 represents the term o'clock, which means it's that hour. So it's the hour of the shorthand, all right? So that's the very obvious difference. Another difference is that analog clocks are typically circular and digital clocks can be rectangular. And in addition to this, digital clocks have colons and analog clocks have hands, like we mentioned before, okay? So let's move on to how to actually tell the time. So as we mentioned in our previous slide, when the long hand is on the 12, that represents the term o'clock, okay? So I will show you how we write that. We write it like this. O apostrophe clock, which means it's the hour that the shorthand is pointing to, or the number that the shorthand is pointing to. So if I wanted to say that the time was 5 o'clock, where would I draw my shorthand on this clock? That's right, I would draw it here. And remember, this hand has to be shorter than the long hand to show that this is the hour and this is the clock. Okay? Or if I asked you, could you please show me what a clock would look like if it was 11 o'clock, where would you draw the line? Yes, so the line would go here. shorter than the long hand and pointing to the 11, okay? So I've got a little exercise below to help consolidate our knowledge and to help us really practice on how to tell the time and what a clock would look like if it was a certain time, okay? So as you can see, we've got an exercise down here, and I've done a few examples for you, okay? So when it's the short hand pointing to 1 and the long hand pointing to 12, it'd be 1 o'clock. Short hand pointing to 2, long hand pointing to 12 would be 2 o'clock, and short hand pointing to 5, long hand pointing to 12, what would it be? 5 o'clock, exactly. So I'm going to allow you to have practice by yourself. So let's work on this together. So I'm going to ask you to draw the following times on the clock that we have here. So I'm going to type them on the side for you, okay? So let's draw. Oh, we've already had that one. 9 o'clock. 7 o'clock. 3 o'clock. And let's say 8 o'clock, okay? Okay, so I'm going to ask you to draw 9 o'clock first. So I'm just going to watch what you do. And if you're stuck, just let me know. Feel free to ask any questions. Okay, great. Now 7 o'clock. Lovely. Now 3 o'clock. And now 8 o'clock. Great. So I can see that you really do understand how to tell the time or how to know what o'clock it would be based on what the short hand is pointing to and what the long hand is pointing to, okay? Excellent. So now let's take it up a notch and let's challenge ourselves further. So instead of just looking at the hours, we'll be looking at the hours and the minutes. So now that we've got another aspect, which is the minutes, it gets a little bit tricky, but I believe in you and I know you can do it. So the shorthand, as we said, represents the hour, excellent, and the longhand represents the minutes, great. Okay, but this time here, what do you think would be? Most people would say that the time would be maybe 2:04, okay? Because the shorthand is on 2 and the longhand is on 4. But actually, the time would be 2:20. Okay, so as you can see, this diagram here shows us how we would say the time to someone if they asked us, what's the time? Okay. So, for example, the reason why it'd be 2:20 is because we need to multiply the number that the long hand is pointing to by 5. So, as we can see, the long hand is pointing to the number 4. So we need to multiply 4 by 5, and that is how we get 20. So if we're asked what is the time, it would be 2:20, okay? Because the long hand is pointing to the 4, 4 times 5 is 20, and the short hand is pointing to the 2, which represents the hour, okay? So I know this can be tricky, but we're going to go through another example, okay? So let's say someone asked us, what would 2:30 look like, or 3:30 even? What would 3:30 look like on a clock? So what we would need to do is the shorthand would point to 3, because remember the hour comes first, so the shorthand's point to 3, and the long hand, where do you think would be pointing? To 6, exactly, because the long hand points to 6, and then we have to multiply 6 by 5. Great. So we end up being 30 instead of 6, so it will end up with our 3:30. Okay? And this is how we would call a time. So let's say that the long hand was pointing on 1, it would be 5 past the hour. If it was pointing to 2, it would be 10 past the hour. It was pointing to 3, it would be quarter past, because it creates a shape that looks a bit like a quarter of a pizza, as you can see. So that's why it'd be called quarter past, okay? If the longhand was on the 4, it would be 20 past the hour. If it was on the 5, it would be 25 past the hour, and so on and so forth. But when we get past the 6, which is past half of the clock, we could say that this would be 25 to, okay? And the reason why it's called 25 to is because, remember, if this longhand is pointing to the 7, that means it'll be 35 minutes past the hour, which means we only have 25 minutes left of the hour because there are 60 minutes in 1 hour. So we're going to say 60 minutes. So we're going to say min in 1 hour, okay? So if 35 minutes of the hour have already passed, that means we just have 25 minutes left to go before we get into the next hour, all right? The same concept follows for all of these numbers that are after the 6. So let's move on to some examples together. If there are any questions you have, or if you'd like me to go through it again, please do let me know. So here are some times down here that I would like you to fill in, and be very, very careful. Remember, the shorthand shows the hour and the longhand shows the minutes. And what must we always remember to do for the minutes? That's right, multiply the minutes by 5, okay? That is exactly what we must always remember to do. Okay, thanks for coming to the lesson, and I hope to see you soon. Remember, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know, and that is the end. Thank you.